Hi, everyone. Welcome. Good to see you all. I will take down this slide in just a moment, but if you're hoping that you're coming to Coffee with the Principals, you're in the right place. So it's great to have you. I think also, yep, you have the chat box available. So if you want to just say hi and you don't have to, but it's a nice way. We're going to be a smaller group, so we'll be able to unmute and certainly have a conversation. But feel free to use the chat box for anything. As always, our parent coffees are, or Coffee with the Principals, it is recorded. So if you need to duck out early, we're here only until 2 o'clock. And but if you need to duck out early, the recording will capture it all. And if for some reason you have friends that are coming late, they'll of course get the recording as well. And then you can also, it'll be available through the e-newsletter and on our events page. So if you know of other Scholé Academy parents that could not make it, then it'll be available to them. So again, thank you so much for coming. It's great to see you all. We haven't done one of these in a couple months. We've had a busy, certainly through Christmas and New Year's, and then the launch of the school. So it's nice that we can revisit this and hopefully meet one more time as well in April before May picks up and gets quite busy. So I thought we could open in prayer just by praying Psalm 23. And then I have a brief reflection that hopefully will inspire good thoughts and sharing, and we'll go from there. And then after prayer, I'll do formal introductions, and we're such a small group, we might be able to also just have everyone say hello. And you can keep your cameras on or off. It's great when we see your face, but I also know it's the middle of the day and you might be listening while you're doing some other things, and that's great as well. So, okay. A Psalm of David. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. So the topic that really inspired Presbytera, Maria, and I to put this together, we focused our conversation on virtue. And certainly, of course, in classical education, Christian classical education, we focus on academics and, the practical aspects of education, but that virtue component, that relationship with Christ, is also really important. And so here are just a couple of resources that I used for my own preparation for today's talk. And so you might have already, whether parent you or classical you might already be familiar with this. We're all familiar with the student virtues as it's laid out in the student parent handbook, but if you haven't had a chance to go back and read it recently, not so much as just information, understanding what we do in the classroom, but to really read it more as a reflection of maybe what you're doing in your own homeschool. I know things take on a different meaning for me when I read something with a different perspective than just reading it for information. The liberal arts tradition, that's another great book. I always have it on my desk because it's just full of important information about what we're doing here at Scholé Academy. and in our classrooms and the ways that we want to support families. So where I want to start before I kind of pose the question, and then also share with you a quote for reflection. This comes, some of it from the liberal arts tradition, and then you can see here, some of it comes from the work of Dr. Perrin, specifically in that Parent U course on, let me go back just one slide there, the classical education, is it right for your children? It's a free resource, but he talks there about what is classical Christian education. And one of the pieces there certainly is this emphasis on virtue, and how do we teach virtue? How do we foster virtue in our students? And to be virtuous, taking it from the Latin, right, is to become more humane. And this idea of human flourishing, not just in academics, but every way of life. And as homeschoolers, this also applies to us, not just our children as students, but we in our roles as, mother or father, friend, student, son, daughter. So there's other roles or offices, if you will, that we hold. And so this question of virtue plays out, certainly not just for our students, but for ourselves, the teacher in the classroom, the parent at home, siblings, how they interact with each other. And I really like very much how Dr. Perrin speaks a lot about human flourishing. And the liberal arts tradition, I'm going to read this to you because it helps kind of move from what Dr. Perrin is talking about to a quote here that I'm going to share with you in just a moment. But so we know from the liberal arts tradition that the ancients believed that the 7 liberal arts were not merely subjects to be mastered, but ways of forming the soul. And this was in order to acquire wisdom. Peter Kreeft, in the introduction to the liberal arts tradition, in the foreword, also talks about classical education seeking truth for its own sake, not primarily for pragmatic uses. So it aims at wisdom, not wealth. It makes its graduates philosophers instead of millionaires. This is also true, but it's not to be seen as a fault, he says. And I think, I know even myself as a parent, we can be in that tension of, we know that there's transcripts, there's grades, there's, planning out the future, whether our children are just starting middle school or they're in high school. And so we do think about colleges, and we think of all the very practical level pieces, which are good. They're not the end of what we're trying to do here. And that's what Peter Kreeft is talking about, that, this type of education is not for that practical end. And that's not a fault in it. And then he quotes Chesterton and he says, man's most practical need is to be more than a pragmatist. So I started to think about that and asking the question of how are we shaping our homeschool and our classrooms to ensure that we are training more than the pragmatist. And just through some other readings that I was doing on the training of young students, this quote came across my desk, and it's a part of a larger piece. But you can see here what I have in bold is what resonated with me. So he starts off, St. Gregory of Nyssa, an ancient church father, saying, sick, our nature demanded to be healed, fallen, to be raised up, dead, to rise again. We had lost the possession of the good. It was necessary for it to be given back to us. Closed in the darkness, it was necessary to bring us the light. Captives, we awaited a savior. Prisoner, help. Slaves, a liberator. There's so much here that hopefully we'll unpack today, and I'm exploring this with you. So I think that's what's really beautiful about the Principal Coffees is this is intended to be a time for us to kind of be renewed, recharged, inspired, edified, or to even leave with a question that we want to continue to think about. And so I was just thinking, in light of the fact that we are currently in Lent, this question, I think, takes on more significance in terms of, how are we shaping our students and our children to be more than a pragmatist. It's rooted in the fact that what we're doing, or I should say, is because of the way that the education, the environment that we're creating in our homes and in our classrooms is rooted in Christ. I think that's a really good starting point. And just to go back to the liberal arts tradition for a moment, Robbie Jane and Kevin Clark define piety as the proper love and fear of God and man, including the duty, respect, and allegiance owed to each. And that definition of piety is helpful when I think about, okay, what are we talking about when we say, we're reclaiming the good? What is the good? And I know in the past 4 years, our faculty, we've also read The Four Cardinal Virtues by Joseph Pieper. Justice was one of the ones we talked about. And so giving to one what is owed them, right, is a part of that understanding of justice. So I definitely think, and then we think of, our Savior and Lord Jesus Christ. When you read about him in Scripture, it is all about justice and truth and goodness. So this idea of perhaps one of the ways that we are hopefully striving not just to train our students or to raise our students not to be just pragmatists, but also ourselves, to keep ourselves oriented, is to know that we're focusing on what is the proper love for all things, but starting with God and man, and then giving those, as the liberal arts tradition defines it, that proper duty, respect, allegiance.
Joanne, would you read that definition of piety one more time?
Absolutely. Yep. The proper love and fear of God and man, including the duty, respect, and allegiance owed to each. If you have the latest version, if you will, it's actually in their glossary in the back of the book on page 289. The book obviously has a whole chapter on it, and actually several chapters on it, but and then just one final piece I'll say here, and then I'll turn it over to the group here just to kind of discuss. But in that Classical U course on the monastic tradition, Dr. Perrin reminds us, and I think this is at least where I connected it to this season of Lent right now, that the monastic tradition teaches us that, there's places and times where we will have to suffer as Christians. Where in our classrooms and our homeschools are we practicing? Are we encouraging? Or I would say, instead of practicing, how are we modeling some of these things for our children, for our students? But how are we encouraging self-denial, temperance, charity? How do we encourage our students and children in the home to walk in some of these difficult paths to reclaim the good? So that's kind of one question that I was thinking about is, what am I doing in my classroom or in my home to reclaim this good? The one piece of that is it's been reclaimed for us. We know that, but because we've lost, or we had lost the possession of it, right? There's a discussion that I think we can have of, how do we see that playing out in our own home, in our homeschool, in our classroom? And so what are we doing to reclaim that good? And one final question is, what is significant about this Lent, reflecting on this particular question of, what are we doing to reclaim this good? So I'll leave it there and just open it up to thoughts, reflections, commentary, what have you.
I think one thing that's been helpful for me with my own children, and actually it was because I was rereading the student handbook, and it was talking about how Aristotle's quote where he talks about the teaching our children to love that which is lovely, that we can order our affections. And so using that idea of loving that which is lovely as the lens through which we look at everything. So when my 12-year-old daughter is saying, Mom, I want to watch Dance Moms, I was struggling, like, that's not, but then when I had this lens to say, well, is that lovely? Does that teach you to order your affections? What do you gain from watching Dance Moms? And so I was able to have the conversation with her about it, saying, the things that you learn from this show are not going to be the things that point you to Christ, and are not going to be the things. And at 12, she's on the cusp of dialectic. And so she's able to, or at least wanting to practice reasoning. And so she was able to come to a mutual conclusion with me that maybe Dance Moms isn't the best thing to do with her time. And so just this encouraging our children to practice self-denial, temperance, and charity, I think it begins with helping them recognize, at least the older ones, and the younger ones we do that for them, but recognizing that we are really to focus our attention on that which is lovely, going back to, and I never can remember Bible verses. I remember what it looks like on my page, but I don't remember the reference. But to think on things that are that which is lovely and good and pure and true and right, think on these things. And it's the same thing. That's what we put into us. So we want to make sure that we're not putting, to use Charlotte Mason's word, twaddle or frivolity. I mean, that's good. There's a place for recreation and fun and even frivolity, but making sure that it is of the right type of fun and good, so that it leads us towards loving that which is lovely. And that's just been huge for me this school year. Just that idea. It's helped me really hone in. And I mean, I've been mothering and teaching for 26 years. And, always wanting this idea, for my children, and in a lot of ways practicing it without that clear focus. I feel like that phrase is just like a laser point for me to help me really hone in on looking at everything and discarding what is not lovely.
I always see a really strong connection, of course, between Advent and Lent. And in our family Advent time this year, we spent a lot of time not dissecting, but looking at the church calendar without anything except colors, and letting it just speak to us in the circularity of it, and the beauty of the colors, and where do we see similarities, and what's happening at those times of year, and what's happening in the rhythms of our lives. And what came out was that Christ has designed us for rest and recreation and relationship. And those three words have sort of formed my launch into Lent, and hopefully my children's as well, into considering, are the things that we are choosing contributing to the formation of what Christ came for? That are the things that we are putting our time and our energies and our resources toward, making us, or creating a space of rest, and creating an environment for recreating. And is it also creating especially the words that we're saying? I'm noticing with my kids, are our word choices helping or hindering relationship? And so those three words for me, and in our family time, in our family classroom, have sort of formed our launch into Lent. And when I asked my kids on Ash Wednesday during our family time in the evening, what was a habit that they thought that as a family we are not very good at? And my 13-year-old son said, being empathetic and considering that others don't see things from our perspective. I was like, okay, I'm going to call that a win that my 13-year-old son came up with that on his own. But at the same time, it didn't feel like a win, because for him to think that our family isn't doing that well, but that he wanted to work on it, that he wanted our family to improve. And I just thought that was a really beautiful way to get us all thinking about that. Are our words creating rest and a space for recreation and a space for relationship? So that's where we are in our Lenten journey.
I like what you said, Elizabeth. Just thinking of what your son said, it just goes back to what Dr. Perrin was saying about virtue, is that a flourishing excellence in every area of life. And obviously what your son was touching on isn't necessarily an academic thing or, of that sort, but it's more the relational piece. And he was thinking of an answer in response to your question of, like, how are we flourishing or not flourishing as a family?
I like what both Christy and Elizabeth had to say, because it really highlights, discernment, of course, and what steps a person will take, but also that tension, right? The tension, being okay in that tension, really is where we see growth, whether it's on the home front or on the classroom front, wherever. That tension is where we see growth. So being okay, being uncomfortable with discussions, with what happens, right? And taking next steps, really, I find is the crux of it, because we have to be okay not to be always comfortable. And I think we tend to want our children to not feel discomfort because we want to take care of them, right? But that discomfort is a place of growth. And so having those conversations like Christy, the show that you mentioned, or Elizabeth with your son, having those conversations that you're like, wait a minute, that's uncomfortable, is where the growth will happen. So I like that sense of, we have to learn and teach our kids to be okay in that tension.
That reminded me, Presbytera, of Thomas Aquinas, when he talks about, or he asks the question, why do people, or he's reflecting on the question, why would a good God allow suffering? And his answer that I come back to all the time is that, because of a nobler end, that God allows suffering because there is a nobler end. And with our own children, that nobler end is children of virtue, children who will seek and love the Lord. And so allowing them, and hoping that they come alongside us and see the vision for that, casting a vision for them of virtue and relationship with God, so that they are willing to do the hard work of self-sacrifice and self-denial and temperance and charity in order to gain the treasure of virtue and righteousness. And it's because there's a nobler end in mind. And so, yeah, suffering and self-denial and difficulty for a season is so worth it. And I think helping our children understand that, and pointing them to the times that they have denied themselves and been happy because of it. I talk to my kids all the time about, think how happy you are when you give a gift to somebody, how excited you are. That's because God made us to give gifts and to think about other people before we think about ourselves. And isn't it better when you give a gift than when you receive a gift. I mean, the joy that you have. And so helping them focus on those times of selflessness and giving, I think helps them recognize that that idea that there is a definitely a nobler end.
I have two different thoughts. The first one, Christy, is just to agree with you, kind of in opening with Psalm 23, that verse, he leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. And that's that higher order of, even just going back to what Chesterton was saying, like, we want our children to be more than pragmatists, because what we're doing is for his namesake, for the glory of God. I mean, whether it's celebrating because we've done well for an accomplishment, or whether we're suffering or working through struggles, to both those paths should be for his namesake. That's a really hard thing for adults to walk and accept. So I just think it reminds me to also reflect and think about the modeling that I'm giving or not giving, to my children in the home or my students in the classroom. The other piece that I was thinking about, and this is kind of where I have the question for some of other people that are here, especially those who might be working with older students, middle and high school, or preparing them, or maybe they're on the other side of it and they've already gone through the high school piece, but just that tension that Presbytera, was talking about at a higher level as a school like Scholé Academy, with a mission and a vision for restful learning. We're always in that tension because we know we work with students and families where there are very practical, real-time needs in terms of educating a child. We talk about them at our college nights. So, and yet we talk about contemplative learning and spending time, to dive deep into things that matter. Dr. Perrin has talked about it, like, grading has its place, transcripts serve a purpose, all of those things. So I guess I'm curious to hear from others, like, how are you assessing that in terms of, what's going really well in that balanced tension, and then what are some places where, they are difficult, and maybe you have some really great insights in terms of, these very practical pieces of home education that you're taking on, but you're trying to stay faithful. In many ways we do it as Christians, we are countercultural, but as homeschoolers with this, specific mission and vision of trying to provide contemplative education, that's also countercultural. So I'm just curious what some of your thoughts are of the successes you've had in that tension, but also the struggles and insights you've gained. And if it's easier for you to type in the chat box, we can always have someone read it too, whatever works for you.
I really like what, the question you posed. Unfortunately, I can't answer it directly because I didn't have that season. But the sense of, how do you navigate all of these decisions at that level? And the sense of, again, it's okay to not hit the mark every single time. I really just like the word fail because it's not about that. It's about, the journey when we think about it. And so when our kids, our young adults, right, don't hit the mark, again, it should be a matter of being okay with being in that tension, regrouping and redirecting again, right, and trying again. And so the sense of the coined phrase, if you don't succeed, try again. I don't know if kids say that anymore, but when I was younger, they did. It's okay to do that. And I think, at least from what I see in our American society, sometimes the emphasis is, be number one, be the best. And then when it's not attained, losing interest, right? Or when they can't come to fruition on anything, losing interest and shifting instead of trying again and being okay in that tension. So I don't have any pragmatic examples, but that's what came to mind when you asked that, Joanne.
Yeah, that reminds me, Presbyterian Maria, about when my kids were younger. They're not super old. I have 4 kids between the ages of 9 and 15, all boys. And when they were younger, I found myself regularly disappointed for what we didn't accomplish in a day or what I didn't accomplish in a day. And being very, I joke that I have an overdeveloped Protestant Dutch work ethic that comes maybe from being part of an immigrant family. But that my disappointment when I looked at that word and really contemplated where is my disappointment coming from, and realized that it's about where I'm appointing my hopes. So I was disappointed because I was misappointing my hopes. And that just little word, that little shift helped me so much to reframe the way I was viewing myself and my children, and has carried me through as a teacher as well. When I end a class and think, well, that was disappointing, like I'm disappointed in myself, or I'm disappointed that my students didn't grasp something, it's really a good reminder to me. And I just feel like it was the Spirit just giving me one little letter difference to help me see life differently, to say, maybe I've misappointed something in that lesson. Maybe I've misappointed my goals for myself. Maybe I've misappointed my hopes. And it really helps me to realign that my hopes are only met when they're appointed to Christ. And we're experiencing that as a family right now. We live in Kenya in the bush, and my husband is, I guess we're missionaries, but my husband is a missionary. He's the one who works on the field. And because we're very isolated, we sent our oldest to boarding school. Gasp. It's the big no-no that any parent who homeschools would feel their heart ripping out at that word. And my oldest 2 years ago sat at the table with us and said, Mom and Dad, it's not that I want friends, it's that I need them. And that I know what you and Dad believe, and I want to try it for myself. And we thought, we knew this to be true about him, but we needed to reappoint our direction for him in a way that was super tension filled. And in the last week, we've actually pulled him out of that boarding school. That was 1 full year plus 2 terms. It's a trimester school. And we've pulled him out of that because we feel very strongly that he has received all that he can from that place. And to leave him there is actually causing a degeneration of of growing. Does that make sense? A decreation. So it's like we've reached that point, that pinnacle of we don't see that there's going to be growth anymore. We see that the growth is stagnated. And now we're bringing him back into the homeschool environment, which most people would think is crazy. But yeah, it's this constant appointing our hopes in ways that linearly, planning wise, practicalities often doesn't make sense. And yeah, I think for us, seeing that our son's school was so focused on ACT scores, SAT scores, grade point average, it was a very traditional, not classical. And we knew that going in. That's not why we sent him. But I had to know that we were putting on pause my academic hopes for him. And but also seeing how much growth took place in other areas in his life and in our family. I couldn't have predicted that there would have been growth in those areas. And so I'm not saying I recommend boarding school, but sometimes our plans just need to shift, and what we expect out of our students or out of our families need to shift too. And that is extremely difficult. Sorry, I talked a long time.
I think you hit on another point, important point when it comes to this and tension is flexibility. You know, if we're not flexible or maybe formable, I don't know, I'm starting to make up words like you, Elizabeth. I just, change the words around, don't get in there, right? If we're not pliable to what's the Lord is wanting us to do and where we're going and where our kids are going, then, we'll break, just like a big oak tree, right? Has deep roots, but it does sway in all of the weather that it encounters. So I think that is key too. And I like that you brought that up, that yes, this was our plan, but now our plan changed. And now it's okay to go back, recalibrate, and make a new plan. And I love that. And I especially love, and Joanne, you're going to laugh when I say it, I especially love to say this: the human brain is not fully grown until your mid-20s, right? It's not fully formed until your mid-20s. So, when we're talking about adulthood or young adulthood, the guidance still needs to be there, even at that age.
Elizabeth, something else you said early on about having disappointment with your, maybe how a school day went or how a class went. It reminds me of, I think it was Sarah McKenzie in Teaching from Rest. I'm not sure if that's exactly where it was from, but I think it was her. She talks about how, she's got all her plans and ideas for the different ways that you can move restfully through school. But she also, I think, talked about how you can have a plan A, like on a perfect day, everything's going to, all the stars will align and you're going to get everything done, and you're going to read poetry and you're going to have a nature study and you're going to do science and math. But then plan B is, we read together and we do our math, and I think she actually has Latin in there too. So that the plan B, when everything doesn't go as well as it should, letting yourself have a fallback as a parent and as a teacher, that if we just cover knowing exactly, and this is where I always come back to, we've got to have a vision and a mission. We've got to know where we want to end up, and we've got to know how we're getting there. And the minimum required for getting to, my husband is a church planner, and so the definition that he talks about for vision, which is my favorite, it's a snapshot of a clear and preferable future. And so if you have that snapshot in your mind of the people you want your children to be, of the adults, of the Christ followers that you want them to be, how do we get there? And if it comes back to virtues, and it comes back to the most important things. I remember there was a season in my life where I was so busy as a pastor's wife and as a teacher with my children and tutoring and all kinds of stuff. And I remember sitting down and writing out the hours before I even got to my homeschool time. And I was spending about 58 hours a week on all the things that were my responsibility before I even got to my homeschooling. I'm like, well, no wonder I'm so dissatisfied with homeschooling. I'm just fitting in the niches. I mean, they're just an afterthought almost. And that's my most important calling right now. So I remember having to just say, well, what's the one thing that I can do? The one step that will make me feel better. Let's not look in leaps and bounds and think, how do I get all the way to my vision? And it was sitting on the sofa and reading with the kids. That was it. And so it was like, I'm picking a good book and we're going to make sure that every day we have an hour to sit on the sofa and read together. And that was what took me on the road back towards recovering my homeschool with my children when I was too busy, and learning to say no to the other things that were had crept in, that all were good things, but they weren't the most important thing. And so all of that, lots of different things, but that came from what you were talking about with being disappointed with ourselves as teachers and as homeschool parents, that giving ourselves grace and just keeping our eye on the prize. Joanne, you read a quote about the 7 liberal arts, not merely subjects to be mastered, but can you finish that for me?
Yeah. Let me pull that back up. So the ancients believed that the 7 liberal arts were not merely subjects to be mastered, but sure and certain ways of forming in the soul the intellectual virtue necessary for acquiring true wisdom. I'll read it one more time because it is a long quote. The ancients believed that the 7 liberal arts were not merely subjects to be mastered, but sure and certain ways of forming in the soul the intellectual virtue necessary for acquiring true wisdom. Andrew Kern, I love how he always talks about the liberal arts. He calls them the tools of truth perception. And I love that. I mean, you could unpack that as well for a while in terms of what does that mean. It's such a completely different approach than just saying like, oh, we're doing math and science and history, and we are doing those things, but we're just doing them in a very different way, because we're starting with these tools, the ways and means to perceive truth.
And I think it goes back to what you were saying too about it not being about utility. I mean, education isn't merely about utility, but it's about repairing the ruin, and regaining to know God aright, and out of that knowledge to love him, to imitate him, to be like him, so that we may be as by the nearest, let's see, I always get that last part mixed up. So we may, as the nearest, by possessing our souls of true virtue, in like addition to faith. I always mess up the last part, but it's Milton. But anyway, it's, just regaining to know God aright. And I think it's having a different end goal in mind. It's not about a high ACT or SAT score. It's about, I used to just say kind of generically educating the whole man. But it's really to hone in on that. It's educating a Christ follower, somebody who knows the Lord, knows God.
Well, and we read about that even from the ancient church fathers. I mean, they were saying, it's okay to read pagan literature. I mean, that's essentially what was going on there in the early church. We had Christians who were going back to the pagans and taking it to what we have now, which is classical Christian education.
I like to put people on the spot. If you haven't had a class with me or your child hasn't, well, this is what I do. But I'm curious to hear, I know the Cooper family is on camera, your thoughts. Why don't you guys start the ball rolling? Like, what comes to mind as we are discussing, this topic? How does it relate to you all and your household?
Yeah, I think that for me, we've been homeschooling for a few years now. And my kids have done public school and private school before. But so when we jumped into homeschooling, I had wanted to do it for a while, and we just weren't in that place to do that. So it's been a fun journey to figure out kind of the difference between regular public school, because that's what I'm a product of, and just kind of that mind shift. And then, you have your different models, and we've done classical since we've started, just so learning, and shifting my mind so that I know exactly how to better homeschool them. Because my husband and I own a business as well. So I'm the primary, I take care of the homeschooling. So, but my mind is also on business at the same time. So cutting my time trying to figure that out, but I still end up reverting, easily to homeschooling. But as my kids get older, for me, there's a whole lot of things going on, but some of the things that I wrote down through the discussion that I was reminded of recently that was said was about modeling. And I was like, when that came back to me, I was like, oh yeah, it's important to model. My kids, children are not going to do what the kids aren't going to do what your mind thinks they're going to do if you're not doing it. So I really had to step back for myself because, leadership is super important for me. I have to be the one to model. Okay, so it really takes an introspection within myself, be like, am I doing well enough to have them follow me, to even desire? And the word virtue, wow, that brings up a lot of thoughts just in itself of what am I doing? Am I doing well enough? So, because my objective is to raise up my children well. So, yeah. So I lost focus along the way. I had plenty of disappointments. I've failed. I've watched my kids fail. And one of them in particular that's just kind of struggled in some different ways. And I had to reassess and look at my hopes. And all those words were things that were said this morning that was like, okay, that's super important to think about as we move forward. And the last thing is the words pliable and perspective were said. And I was thinking, I was like, we have to be pliable in order to see different perspectives, because it's easy I know in my mind, I'm like, it's easy to be like, yeah, I don't understand that. That doesn't make sense. But if I allow myself to be pliable and open-minded towards other people, my perspective, I still am myself, but I can see other people's viewpoints better.
I think one of the things that I've appreciated from today's lesson was that, along with what Lori was saying, that we've caught several different things. She's been taking notes that y'all have been mentioning. But one of the things that I believe is strong is, like Lori just said, and she heard it from one of y'all, perspective is important. I'm pretty sure everybody on this call today can appreciate electricity in one form or another and how they use it on a daily basis. So many different ways to use electricity. But Benjamin Franklin, he says, I didn't fail. I learned how to do it wrong 100 times. And so we've we fail. When I say we, I mean collectively as humanity. We fail at different times. Hopefully, God gives us the grace to stand back up, rebound, learn from that mistake, not to do it wrong again, make another attempt, give us the fortitude to move forward and try it differently. Change the formula. He had to change the formula a few times. Change the formula and move forward, because success is in front of you, always in front of you. You're either enjoying it or it's in front of you. And we are enjoying our success with our kids, homeschooling. And I appreciate what difficult thing that Elizabeth and her family went through to send her son off for a time, only to come back. That's difficult. That's challenging. That may have felt like a failure, but it wasn't. You came together as a family stronger, right, Elizabeth? So when the perception may have seemed like it was a failure, you had a long-term plan. You had the plan A. You had to go through some plan B time to get back to your plan A. That's all I have.
Yeah, I really appreciate what you've said. And it reminds me of a song I wrote based on Psalm 103 last year during Lent, 2 years ago during Lent. And it's right after the psalmist says, as far as he's removed our transgressions from us, as far as the east is from the west, that sort of sense of failure as transgression or the plan B, like we got off the path. I love what comes next, which just sends us right back to Ash Wednesday, right? As a father has compassion on his children, so the Lord has compassion on those who fear him. For he knows how we're formed. He remembers that we're dust. Praise God. The life of mortals is like grass. They flourish like a flower of the field. The wind blows over it and it is gone, and its place remembers it no more. But from everlasting to everlasting, the Lord's love is with those who fear him, and his righteousness with their children's children. What a gorgeous promise. And you just reminded me of that. Thank you.
Yeah, I love what you all said, Cooper Homestead, jointly and separately. I like that you say, okay, plan A, we detoured to plan B for a while, and now we're back to plan A, which is plan A is following the paths of Christ, right? And so, yes, it takes us on detours, etc., but then we ultimately come back to that narrow gate. And I really like the imagery of that, right? That even though we may miss the mark, we're gleaning something from it, but going back to the narrow gate journey. That is, it's beautiful. I really like that. So thank you.
I like another thing that you said too. It reminded me of what my husband says, that if something's worth doing, it's worth doing poorly.
Well, I know we're coming down just a minute or two, and I just wanted to add kind of where we started with Psalm 23, verse 6, that word surely, surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. That sense of, well, I mean, that's faith, right? In God's plan. I was reminded of that, Elizabeth, when you were talking about Psalm 103. It's that same, the David the psalmist here saying, surely, like having confidence in God's plan and not forgetting that. And then kind of going back to this question of, how are we participating in reclaiming the good in our homeschool or classrooms? and in light of Lent, I mean, isn't it always that, you know, repent and turn to the Lord, or turn back to the Lord? I mean, we recognize all of those ways. And so I think, you know, we haven't talked a lot about repentance in that way, but I think as teachers and parents, we're always doing that. We're always refining and looking, and kind of like what you said, Mr. Cooper, about like we've done, or we've tried all the ways that we've recognized as wrong to get to the right. I mean, that's kind of, that is that journey. And so I think very much God's mercy is always present there in our homeschools when we're approaching it in that way, and keeping this idea of the bigger picture for his name's sake. It isn't obviously just for the grades or the diploma or getting to that college, or, you know, whatever it is, but it's something much greater. So I don't know if anyone has any other closing comments. I always enjoy our time together. It moves so quickly. So I hope everyone leaves today with something that resonates with you. Like I said, to inspire you, or give you something to certainly pray about. And hopefully you feel a little bit more refreshed to go back into the afternoon. But thank you so much for coming, and we'll do another one most likely in April, so look for that. And then this recording will be available. If you'd like to come back and listen to it or share it, it'll be available through the e-newsletter, and probably on the events page. I think that's where we put them with all of our other events. So thanks, everybody. Thank you, Presbytera Maria, for being here, principal of St. Raphael School and manager of the Tutoring Center. And then I'm doing the introductions at the end. Christy Stoddard, Culture and Events Coordinator. Elizabeth Kaufman is one of our teachers and a homeschooling mother. And then to all of our parents that are here, thank you so much. The work we do is definitely for you. So we thank you for your support and your invitation that you bring us into your home through Zoom. So we're glad to be there with you. Have a great afternoon, everybody. Bye-bye.